Aston Villa, when the pressure was really on them, they couldn't deliver. They didn't turn up.
The goal ended up being disallowed, probably too prematurely, by Thomas Bramall, the referee. But it was a game-changing decision.
You would have probably expected United to have capitulated then, probably at that point. So it did feel like a massive moment. It was a huge mistake from the referee, there's no doubt.
They only needed a point in the end, and that's why that disallowed goal was so important, because I take on board what Dean was saying. United probably would have collapsed, but even if they equalised, that would have been enough for Villa to get into the top 5. They've fallen short, and I do wonder about their big game mentality, because they were really poor in the semi-final against Palace, and they were equally poor on Sunday.
Maybe there just needs to be a bit of perspective still with Aston Villa, with how quickly he's risen them to the position that they've been in. Actually, the Europa League is still a great achievement for Aston Villa.
They spent £1 billion, Chelsea. When the owners came in, they were recent European champions, so I would suggest that qualifying for the Champions League should be the minimal ambition and expectation. I mean, imagine if he actually achieved anything tangible, Enzo Moresca. What would he do then to answer his critics? I think that maybe they played Forest at the right time, because the wheels have come off there a few weeks ago. They still had to go there and get the victory. Everything went their way, didn't it? Newcastle getting beat, Aston Villa having a meltdown.
If they win on Wednesday night against Real Betis, that will be something tangible that they can pick up and display in the trophy cabinet, even if you're not a big sort of lover of the Conference League.
I think he's overachieved with what was such a very difficult summer. The amount of players that he had to deal with. There's been some ups and downs, of course there has, and there's some difficulties because Cole Palmer's gone way off the boil. To bring silverware in your first season, I think would be a great achievement for Enzo Moresca.
I feel sorry for the Forest fans. Listen, they've had a great year. They're back in Europe for the first time in 30 years. They'd have taken that at the start of the season, but I think a few weeks ago they were daring to dream of the Champions League. I don't feel sorry for the owner. I don't think he's handled himself particularly well. I think it's going to be very difficult for Forest to match their achievements of this year. It wouldn't surprise me actually if they have a bit of a hangover and start next season badly. And if they do, then who knows what Marinakis might do.
He wouldn't change the manager, would he?
I wouldn't be surprised, but I think it would be incredibly harsh. Nuno was the next step from Cooper, and then there's another level to go again. Now they're in Europe. Now they're in Europe next season. He might feel that, especially the way they ended the season, that there'll be a manager out there that's got that extra experience and can maybe now change the style, because you'd be surprised if that can work again.
So it's Premier League All Access with me, Sam Matterface, talkSPORT's chief football correspondent Alex Crook, and Dean Ashton, the former England striker, West Ham striker, in the building as well. What a final day. The Premier League season is now in the rear-view mirror, and it may have been a slightly below-par season overall, but the final day certainly had plenty of drama. Let's get into the final day. The title race was over a long time ago, but everybody was racing to get into the Champions League. Well, I was at Old Trafford for Manchester United 2, Aston Villa 0, and we will go back and have a look at the season as a whole towards the end of the podcast, where we sort of reflect on who's made the biggest impact, players, managers, etc., etc. But in terms of the final day experience itself, I actually thought, especially the first half, Dean Ashton, was a bit sort of underwhelming. There wasn't that much happening, but certainly that changed in the second half.
It did, yeah. I was at home, sort of taking it all in, and I could really get across everything. But I was just thinking, this isn't the last day. Normally, there's just so many goals. The percentage of goals goes up, and I was expecting that, and it just wasn't there to start with, and it kind of felt a little bit like that's what the Premier League had been a little bit like for most of the season. Second half, obviously, then started to build, and the pressure started to build, and at one point, obviously, you know, with Newcastle dropping out and Villa with the opportunity to get into the Champions League, and then that all turning around, it was great second half.
3 wins since 1964 going to Old Trafford for Aston Villa. Is that sort of one of those statistics that, obviously, none of those players have been involved in those games over the course of many, many years, but that's a sort of historical quirk, isn't it, that seems to happen. And it was a quirk, wasn't it? Because Manchester United were brilliant and Aston Villa just didn't turn up.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think history comes into it. I think it was the pressure of the situation, certainly that got into the head of Emi Martinez. I'm not sure what he was thinking, racing out and just kiboshing Rasmus Højlund. This is Rasmus Højlund, after all. If you've got any kind of speed of thought at that moment, you think, well, he never scores anyway. Just let him go and he'll probably miss it.
That's harsh.
Well, harsh but fair.
Well,
but
it was an open goal. He would have scored it.
He'd have put it in the side net, and you mark my words. But in terms of the Manchester United performance, I think it was even more infuriating for most supporters, because if they played like that on Wednesday night in Bilbao, they probably have won the Europa League. But again, it just tells you about the mindset of that particular dressing room, that when the pressure's off, they can produce their best football.
It's
and actually,
not a Manchester
the flip
United
side, the flip
story.
side, Aston Villa, when the pressure was really on them, they couldn't deliver. They didn't turn up.
He can't help talking about Manchester United. It's actually a very big Aston Villa story. And the fact is, Dean, is that the pressure did get to them. It got to Emi Martinez. And yes, there was that huge moment where the goal ended up being disallowed, probably too prematurely, by Thomas Bramall, the referee. And therefore, the idea of getting into the Champions League, just the seeds of doubt that were already creeping, I think, into their minds, started to take root in their heads. But it was a game-changing decision, because it was Manchester United dominated it, but it was 0-0 at the time. Had that goal been allowed, they would have had something to defend. So it does have a major influence on the rest of the game.
Of course it did, and it would have had an influence on Manchester United's mentality, having had the week that they'd had, and the disappointment of the Europa League final and the fallout from that. You would have probably expected United to have capitulated then, probably at that point. So it did feel like a massive moment. It was a huge mistake from the referee, there's no doubt about it, especially not letting the ball just hit the back of the net, and for VAR to actually be able to intervene the way it should do in those really important situations that are always so difficult to see with the naked eye. No fault of the referee for not maybe being able to see exactly if Bayindir had his hands on the ball or not. That's where you want VAR to be able to step in. And rightly so, Villa are annoyed about it and will continue to be annoyed about it. But ultimately, you know, the game had changed significantly at that point with the sending off.
Yeah, the sending off where Emi Martinez probably, well, he not only didn't show poor judgment, he actually put his team in a very difficult position, but he has contributed to, over the course of the season, getting them into a position where they could challenge for the Champions League. So they won't be too harsh on him. However, I do think that could end up being his final act as the Aston Villa goalkeeper. What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, it could well be, and it would be a sad end to bow out. I think if Jan Oblak leaves Atletico Madrid this summer, then Emi Martinez is their first choice. There's been talk, actually, that Manchester United are interested as well. I don't really think he fits the age profile necessarily of what they'd be looking for. But he's not been great this season, Martinez, and a lot of rival fans will delight in his misfortune, because he's that type of character, isn't he? He winds up fans behind the goal. He winds up fans of opposing teams. So there will be some people who say this is karma, but it's unfortunate for him. It's unfortunate for Villa, because
you're one of those people.
Yeah, a little bit.
Why?
Because
you love winding up
I do.
Other opposition fans.
I do. So therefore, when it goes against my team, as it did on Wednesday, you have to swallow it up. But I do think it's a little bit unlucky for Villa as well, because they've had such a good season. You know, the great moments in the Champions League, ultimately fell short there. They had a really good FA Cup run, didn't turn up in the semi-final against Palace, and they were in position to qualify for the Champions League. They only needed a point in the end, and that's why that disallowed goal was so important, because I take on board what Dean was saying. United probably would have collapsed, but even if they equalised, that would have been enough for Villa to get into the top five. They've fallen short, and I do wonder, and Pard's pushed back on this, Alan Pardew, when we were on air with him on Monday morning, about their big game mentality, because they were really poor in the semi-final against Palace, and they were equally poor on Sunday.
I think this performance has been coming from them, because if you look at their last few weeks, they've been sort of edging over the line. The Bournemouth game, they just about got there. I was at the Fulham game when they just about won that match. They got in front and then almost sat back and just allowed the game to happen and got over the line. They looked a little bit tentative in the match yesterday, and they were a shadow of the team that played with such intensity during the Champions League campaign. So the upshot is that Villa are out of the Champions League for next season. They're not going to make it. They're going into the Europa League. That comes with different a different set of problems, doesn't it? Because ultimately, that Thursday to Sunday scenario has never really been resolved by anybody. It also impacts on their squad and the depth of their squad and how big a squad they're going to carry. What are the differences that you need between a Europa League squad, Dean, and a Champions League squad?
I think quality for a start, but I don't think Villa will be necessarily thinking that way. It might have an influence on the recruitment in the summer, of course, because of what players place in terms of importance on the Champions League. I think it's just that it's the preparation side of things. That's what can be upsetting. And players are creatures of habit. And I think we've seen teams struggle at times with that Sunday game after the Thursday, but they shouldn't really. They're now adapted, you would say, Aston Villa, and the squad is starting to sort of fatten up in terms of the quality. I expect them to do business as well in the summer in terms of outs and ins. And they've got a man, I think, at the helm that knows what he's doing in these competitions, whether it is the Champions League or the Europa League. And that to me is very, very important. And actually, maybe there just needs to be a bit of perspective still with Aston Villa, with how quickly he's risen them to the position that they've been in. Actually, the Europa League is still a great achievement for Aston Villa.
And I totally get that. My point on the squad is that actually they're more of a Champions League squad than they are a Europa League squad, because a Europa League squad tends to be a core group of really top professional players that want to get into the Champions League, and then a lot of younger players that are fighting to get in there that end up being used a lot more in the Europa League, especially in the early rounds. Whereas now they've got quite not a bloated squad, but a big squad of players that probably believe they should be playing Champions League football, have played Champions League football, have had a taste of it, and probably want more. So keeping that together is not as easy as maybe you would think, bearing in mind, as Dean said, actually getting into Europe is in itself an achievement, because before Unai Emery had turned up, they hadn't been in Europe for 13 years.
Yeah, but they've got players going back to their parent clubs. I mean, I think it's been clear for a while that Marcus Rashford won't stay, and he definitely won't now they're not in the Champions League. Interesting to see what they do with Asensio, because I think he's the type of player who's going to want to play Champions League football as well. Axel Disasi is only on loan, isn't he, from Chelsea? So he'll go back. We mentioned Emi Martinez.
They bought Marlon.
Yeah, Marlon will be there, but actually he might be quite happy that these players are going to leave the club.
He might get in the European squad this time.
He might be picked, but there are question marks over the likes of Yuri Tillemans. I know they're trying to tie him down to a new contract. I think they probably do need a backup option to Ollie Watkins, having sold John Duran. It's asking a lot, isn't it, of Ollie Watkins to play all those games next season.
No Garnacho or Onana for United. Reports pre-kickoff suggesting that both have been asked to find new clubs this summer, although both of them went on the post-season tour last night. Garnacho looked particularly happy about that as well. Amorim seemed to sort of offer a bit of an olive branch to Garnacho later on in the day. Do you think that those are players that Manchester United should retain, Dean Ashton?
I think it's really difficult because we don't know the behind the scenes, which I think is really important and something that's clearly affected Amorim since he's come in and having to deal with that. I think he'll want as fresh a squad as he possibly can. So it depends on what they can get for certain players, but I think he'll want to be able to turn over as many players as possible. And especially with the system he's got, he's already been able to look and see that so many of those players certainly haven't fitted into that. And I think the way he spoke yesterday, to me, was of a man that is confident that he's going to get certain players that are going to fit the way he plays. And I thought it was very interesting, how he spoke on the pitch after the game.
Yeah, and what he needs is you, isn't it, really? Let's be honest. He needs a goal scorer. He needs someone who can put the ball in the back of the net. They scored 44 Premier League goals. I mean, Dean, you probably score that on your own.
Probably. No, I think, again, that they've looked at recruitment. They've gone for young with the potential, haven't they? They haven't realised, maybe naively, that Manchester United is such a gigantic football club that the pressure is so high every single game. And I think they'll adjust that in who they're looking at this summer. But again, yes, you're a huge football club, but what player wants to join your club, top player, and not have any European football at all, or even prospects of challenging in the top half of the league?
Yeah, that's a big question for another day. It looks like they're going to get Matthias Cunha and he's going to wear the number 10 shirt next season, which almost confirms that Rashford is off, but I think we knew that anyway. Nottingham Forest against Chelsea finished 1-0 to the Blues. Chelsea winning only the second Premier League game away from home in 11. Enzo Moresca afterwards basically gave everybody the metaphorical middle finger and told those who had criticised him that they should, in English, F off, he said. Was he right to have a go at the media and the supporters who doubted his team? Bearing in mind, he told everybody who would listen in December, this team aren't ready to compete for the championship.
Well, that's the point. He's spent the whole season dampening expectations and then all of a sudden comes out fighting once he's got them back in the top four. They spent £1 billion, Chelsea. When the owners came in, they were recent European champions. So I would suggest that qualifying for the Champions League should be the minimal ambition and expectation. I mean, imagine if he actually achieved anything tangible, Enzo Moresca. What would he do then to answer his critics? It's great they got over the line, and not many of them, even you as a Chelsea fan, thought they would. I think that maybe they played Forest at the right time because the wheels have come off there a few weeks ago, but they still had to go there and get the victory. Everything went their way, didn't it? Newcastle getting beat, Aston Villa having a meltdown at Old Trafford. But they've benefited from that. They're in the Champions League. I'm intrigued to see how they get on in the Champions League with this model of signing young players. You've mentioned the bench a few times this season. I don't think the squad is deep enough to compete in the Premier League and the Champions League next year.
Certainly, they're going to need a little bit more experience, and Moresca has been saying that, but that's not necessarily the model that Chelsea want to go down. I mean, Crook talked about them getting something tangible. If they win on Wednesday night against Real Betis, that will be something tangible that they can pick up and display in the trophy cabinet, even if you're not a big sort of lover of the Conference League. But I must admit, Dean and I have experienced the euphoria of a Conference League final before. If you look at it from an outside position looking in, Conference League winners, Champions League next season, how would you rate Enzo Moresca's debut campaign?
I think he's overachieved with what was such a very difficult summer. The amount of players that he had to deal with, get rid of, decide who was going to be in that training squad, in the playing squad, and then get them to play in a way that he wanted. There's been some ups and downs, of course there has, and there's some difficulties because Cole Palmer's gone way off the boil, away from what he was, and I think that's hampered some of their results. But ultimately, again, I'm somebody that believes no club is too big to think that they can't win a trophy, and that there's no point. It doesn't mean anything really to win a trophy. That to me is I just can't get my head around that mentality. So
agreed.
To bring silverware in your first season, I think would be a great achievement for Enzo Moresca. And I watched that yesterday, that game, all the way through, and I was really impressed. He had seen certainly the lack of confidence at Forest, but they sat really, really deep, knowing that Forest's strength is on the counter-attack. They just sat there, they defended properly, they were then a threat on the counter-attack, and I just thought, I was impressed with that. He'd seen the way to get over the line, and that impressed me.
I've mentioned it to you. The players like him. The players like Enzo Moresca, and they like him for this reason. He's out on the coaching pitch every day. He's part of it. He's involved in it. He's not a satellite coach that sits on the sidelines and lets others take most of the sessions. He does most of the coaching himself. He's in it with the players, which is one of the reasons why they're so fond of him. I think less so the Chelsea supporters. I don't think there's a universal sort of clamour and love for him in the way that there maybe has been for previous managers in the past. Big problem for Chelsea. They change managers so often, it's very difficult to sort of forge that relationship now. And more importantly, I think he says silly things every now and again. And one of those silly things was the title race thing. The other thing was that he didn't have to get Champions League football. Now he's saying he wanted to get Champions League football all along, and it was a 2-year plan. But why not? I wanted to do it in the first season. And do you know what? Just some of the things he said about the supporters as well haven't sat right. Now maybe that's because it's been lost in translation. However, I just think that he needs a better PR going forward into the new campaign. Talking of PR, Nuno Espirito Santo handled himself brilliantly after the Marinakis episode a couple of weeks ago, but his team, who were having a fairy tale season and looked almost dead set of getting into the Champions League, have fallen off right at the very last. Was that pressure?
Yeah, maybe. And also, I think over the second half of the season, opposition teams, as Dean's alluded to with Moresca, worked out how best to stifle them. I feel sorry for the Forest fans. Listen, they've had a great year. They're back in Europe for the first time in 30 years. They'd have taken that at the start of the season, but I think a few weeks ago they were daring to dream of the Champions League. I don't feel sorry for the owner. I don't think he's handled himself particularly well. Whatever the explanation that was given for storming onto the pitch after the Leicester game, it wasn't a great look optically. Wasn't a great look banning Gary Neville as a TV pundit at the weekend either. And I think there's going to be pressure on Nuno now at the start of next season because we know that Marinakis is hot-headed sometimes with his decisions. I think it's going to be very difficult for Forest to match their achievements of this year. It wouldn't surprise me actually if they have a bit of a hangover and start next season badly. And if they do, then who knows what Marinakis might do.
He wouldn't change the manager, would he, Dean? In the summer, he's a ruthless character, and sometimes he makes big decisions that he will say are to kick the club on going forward. But having tailed off so badly at the end of the campaign, he wouldn't pull the plug on it and go for a different approach, would he?
Oh, I'm pretty sure he would. Yeah, I think he's such an ambitious owner. I think he would see we're moving on to the next step, and almost Nuno was the next step from Cooper, and then there's another level to go again. Now they're in Europe. Now they're in Europe next season. He might feel that, especially the way they ended the season, that there'll be a manager out there that's got that extra experience and can maybe now change the style. Because you'd be surprised if that can work again for them. Now everybody really understands how they've played. So I wouldn't be surprised, but I think it would be incredibly harsh.
Yeah, he'll be looking at the data as we've been looking at the data, and they have overachieved in certain areas this season, and that's why they've ended up getting where they are. But if you look at the fact that they haven't played European football since 95-96, just getting into the Conference League at the beginning of the campaign would have been a massive, massive overachievement for Nottingham Forest. And actually, when you look at it in the round, it probably should be viewed that way rather than a major disappointment of not getting into the Champions League where they were for so long.
Yeah, but this is an owner who told our own Jim White after they won promotion in the Championship playoff final, they weren't just there to make up the numbers. He was going to take Forest back to the glory days under Brian Clough. So we know he's ambitious. And actually, if he's in charge of your football club, you probably would welcome that ambition. But it does put managers under a lot of pressure, particularly when things aren't going their way.
It certainly does. Let's check out some of the other games now. Let's start with the game at St James's Park. Talk about nerves and tension. Well, Newcastle have been so brilliant at home, Dean. They'd won the previous 6 Premier League games at St James's Park before Everton came to town. And then scored 20 goals during that process. And then just didn't turn up on Sunday. That was pressure. That was tension. That was anxiety, wasn't it?
It was, especially with Everton missing talkSPORT and Branthwaite as well. You sort of felt it would have been a pretty routine victory for Newcastle. But look, Isach wasn't fit. I think that's pretty obvious. Gordon obviously maybe wasn't right either, and the pressure got to them. That's all you can really say, and maybe credit to Everton. I think moving to their new home, I think they could be a surprise next season for sure if David Moyes can bring in the right players. But it was a massive disappointment. They're very, very lucky actually, Newcastle, that it didn't cost them.
Yeah, interesting because it's worth pointing out they only got into the Champions League. They snuck into the Champions League because Aston Villa lost at Manchester United. Had that game finished as a draw, then Aston Villa would have been in the Champions League, and we'd be talking about them and Newcastle falling out now. You mentioned Anthony Gordon there, Dean Ashton. And Crook, he has had a difficult campaign, hasn't he? He missed that penalty against Everton earlier in the season. He didn't play very much at the European Championship. He was sent off in the game against Brighton. He had a bit of a renaissance where he scored a few goals and influenced the games well, but his assists and goals are down on his previous campaign. Missed the Carabao Cup final because of the red card. Then picked up an injury. Eddie Howe's got a bit of work to do in the summer, I think, to revive that confident character that we saw last season.
Yeah, he has that, but I think he's one of a number of players actually from that England squad who struggled on the back of the European Championships, but certainly he's been outshone by Murphy and maybe to a lesser extent at the end of the season, Harvey Barnes as well. And they're looking at wide players to come in. So, yeah, I think he's got a job on his hands to guarantee himself a place in the starting 11 next season. We know Newcastle have to balance the book still for PSR purposes, though Eddie Howe saying maybe not quite as much as they did this time last year.
You said that storm's not coming now.
Yeah, but I still think he could be one that if a big offer came in, they would have to consider it.
Interesting. Alexander Isaac is another one who's been linked with moves away. And Eddie Howe actually said, I don't understand why everyone's being linked with the move away. They can achieve their aims and ambitions with us here at Newcastle United. Does getting Champions League football secure the services of Alexander Isaac next season, Dean Ashton, do you think?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I think the way he's spoken in the media at times, I think, lends itself to an even higher ambition than Newcastle can possibly give him. Are Newcastle going to challenge for the Premier League title next season? You would probably say...
Why not? In the second half of the season, they were the second best team.
Yeah, but they weren't in the first half. So it's you can't just go off 6 months. And ultimately, the summer business is going to be key, I think, in terms of who they bring in. If I'm Alexander Isaac, then I will be looking at who you're bringing in. I will be asking the question, actually, of who you're bringing in. Who are you going to bring in that's going to elevate this team even further, give me better players around me? Because if not, there will be so many clubs that will be after. And it wouldn't surprise me, actually. I think he's been that good. It wouldn't surprise me if a massive, massive offer did come in for his services. Maybe just the injury record could be the only thing that maybe stopped a top side doing that.
Yeah, interesting, because who's going to be doing the recruitment at Newcastle United? Because we're hearing there's going to be a change in the chain of command above Eddie Howe. So who's pulling the strings there? Well,
listen, Eddie always wants a big say in recruitment, which is why it's always a bit difficult for any sporting director. But yeah, we are hearing whispers that maybe there could be a change at the top end of the football club. We need to get that doubly confirmed. But his recruitment team will already be working on potential targets, because I think he will know they need to strengthen. Callum Wilson, we expect to leave the football club, so they do need another striker. That's why they've spoken to Liam Delap, although he wants to be guaranteed minutes, which he won't get all the time. Alexander Isak is there. Mark Gay remains a target, and I know Eddie was really trying to drive that one last summer. So they are going to do business, but I agree with Dean. I don't think they're quite at the stage at Newcastle where they can compete in the Champions League and have a real go at the Premier League title. I think if they end up in the top 4 or 5 again next season, that would be another great achievement.
I think it's really amazing. I mean, and I don't understand really how teams are supposed to do it, because if you speak to coaches tell you, I only want 23, 24 players. If you speak to the financial people, they say PSR is happening us. We can't spend money. We can get to the Champions League, but we can't spend money when we get there. So how do you negotiate the twin competitions of the Premier League and the Champions League? Unless you're one of the very, very big teams with infinite resources and a huge squad and of experience of being able to do it, how do you juggle both of those competitions? Because you can't buy your way to get competitive, and you can't carry too big a squad that's too loaded or bloated, because you end up annoying everybody and ends up disharmony creeping into the camp. So what do you do, Dean?
Well, I think you have to get everything else absolutely spot on. You have to have one of those seasons, I think, that we've seen in the past, and that's obviously very difficult to do. You've got to be lucky with injuries. I think it's underestimated at times what the history of a club does for people that are signing, and especially signing from abroad. When they're looking at the Champions League, Liverpool has that big pull because of the history that it has with the competition. Manchester United, if it was in it, again, because of that history that's weighted in their favour. But you're absolutely right. I think it's so hard now to punch your way into that top 2 or 3 in the Premier League, which is why I probably don't expect it. It would have to be something spectacular for them to leapfrog into those positions.
Yeah, it's so hard, isn't it? And I wonder whether or not there's a change coming where you almost have to have a sort of, almost two squads, and actually you almost have not two coaches, but someone has to take responsibility for those players that aren't necessarily in the first team on a week-to-week basis, so that you can keep everybody involved, or you do even more rotation. I don't know, but you're going to need more than 23 players going forward if the games are going to keep exponentially multiplying every single season, and the intensity of the division is going to be as high as it was this campaign. And on that basis, Manchester City have secured third.
Yeah.
Pep Guardiola spoke to you afterwards, and he said, I don't want too many players.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating from Pep. And I've got to say, that was one of the best interviews that he's given me, because he was so humble after ending up third in the table. He said, this is like another title. After the season we've had, when it became clear that we couldn't challenge for the Premier League, we could have given up. And he said, we haven't done that, and we've made sure we've at least got Champions League football. Obviously lost out in the FA Cup final as well. But then when you started to ask him about Jack Grealish and his future, he said they've got too many players. He described the last 2 weeks of the season as a nightmare, because he's having to leave 5 or 6 players out of the squad. He says that demotivates the team or the individuals that are left down. It also causes fractures in the dressing room. His words, not mine. So it sounds like Jack Grealish will be moving on after all this summer, but it also sounds like he doesn't necessarily want the huge influx of new signings that maybe we were anticipating. I just thought it was a really telling insight. And as I say, Pep can be a tricky customer post-match. He's often better in defeat than victory, but he was really good on Sunday.
Right, other final day stories. Liverpool 1, Crystal Palace 1. A double guard of honour before kickoff. So basically, Palace come out and they give Liverpool a guard of honour, and then Liverpool run through it, go the other side,
What a load of nonsense,
honour,
honestly.
and Palace run through that because those two will be playing in the Charity Shield in August.
Stick your guards of honour in room 101. Honestly, they've become my pet hate of football. Pathetic.
Dino, glorious to watch a guard of honour. It shows it's a sign of wonderful respect. It's not, as our producer Jeremy has written here, utter woke nonsense.
Of course it's not, because what it does is it makes the players have to suffer doing it, doesn't it?
Who was suffering there then?
If you're not suffering, if both of them are doing it. Oh, you're brilliant. No, you're brilliant.
Obviously not yesterday, but normally it's horrible, isn't it, for that team that has to stand there and let them through. But like you said, yesterday just went a little bit too far.
Trent Alexander-Arnold was given a good reception, though, in that game, because Jurgen Klopp basically came out and played a diplomat.
I thought he was brilliant in how he spoke. I thought he spoke with so much passion about Trent Alexander-Arnold. He was there yesterday, obviously, Jurgen, to watch the celebrations. And I think if you've watched that yesterday afterwards and think that it doesn't, Trent doesn't care, then you're lying to yourself, and especially, it's incredible, isn't it? As soon as his mum came onto the pitch, he basically properly broke down, and you could see how emotional he was with having to leave Liverpool and what that's going to mean for him going forwards and the time that he's had there. And I'm just really glad, actually, that he got the reception that he did in the end from the Liverpool supporters, because there has to be that bond there, and he's such a wonderful player for them. But it's an exciting time for him, and he should be excited.
Yep, he certainly should be. Latest on Florian Vertz, Leverkusen saying they've had in excess of £100 million bid from Liverpool for him. Is he going there?
Yeah, certainly the two clubs have been in dialogue on Monday morning. Personal terms already agreed. They've informed Bayern Munich, Florian Vertz, that he wants to go to Liverpool. So it looks like they're going to pull this off. And that's a heck of a statement this early in the transfer window. The window doesn't officially open until next week, to get a player of that quality in. And I think the reason for it is they realise that by losing Trent Alexander-Arnold, they're losing a lot of their creativity. Clearly, they can't find a like-for-like replacement in terms of the right-back area, so that creativity is going to come higher up the pitch.
Yeah, we'll see what happens there. Tottenham 1, Brighton 4. Tottenham have got Champions League football to worry about. They can't manage to marry Europa League football and Premier League football together. I think Ange said it in his post-match press conference after the final. He decided in January he was basically giving up on the Premier League campaign and going all in on the Europa League. If you can't balance those two competitions, how are they going to balance Champions League and Premier League football next year? Dean?
Well, he needs help, is what he needs. He needs the board to extend themselves further than they have done if you don't match other clubs, wages that they're going to pay players, you are going to struggle to get the absolute best players. Their recruitment style is generally younger that can be developed, and it certainly is currently with the squad that they have. So it depends how they see things. It depends whether the ownership, feel like this is just a great bonus that we've got, and we're going to, use the money wisely still, or whether they think actually this is an opportunity that's fallen on our laps to try and grab hold of it and catapult themselves back to challenging more for Champions League places in the league. But he needs more help, because as soon as a few injured players arise, then he's not able to play the way he wants to. And ultimately, he's shown you that he can play differently. So it's whether they trust him with the recruitment that they bring in.
Brighton finished 8th in Hertzler's first season. I think that's been a pretty good campaign. They might rue a couple of situations in April and in December where they could have won matches, should have won matches. They didn't beat Leicester over the course of the season, which is always a worry. If they'd done that, they would have been in Europe probably next season. But I think largely for a 32-year-old managing a Premier League team, he's done a pretty good job. Congratulations to Sunderland. Crook and I were at the Championship playoff final where Tommy Watson scores a terrific last-second goal to steer them into the Premier League. I think it'll be entertaining to see what happens with them coming up, although 11 of the last 20 teams that have been promoted have gone straight back down again. They have a very young squad and they're going to have to do some serious recruitment in the summer, but they know that won't be a new thing. So let's round things off by picking up some awards and dishing out some awards. I did bring the Big Baby Award, by the way, for you. It's in the back of my car. You'll have to come and get that tomorrow. But we've got a Player of the Year, Young Player of the Year, Manager of the Year, and Surprise Contributor of the Season. So, Dean Ashton, do you want to rattle a few off first of all? Who was your Player of the Season and why?
So my player of the season was Mo Salah. It has to be. You can't produce the goals and assists that he has in the Premier League at the rate that he did, having maybe had a bit of a dip the season before, towards the end of the season, and not be player of the year. To me, the game is about end product. There can be all the passing in the world, there can be all the great football, but you need end product. And actually, he's got better in terms of his creativity, which I think is credit to him. I can't really see how you can look past him. The only other one that got close for me was Virgil van Dijk, but for me, Mo Salah was just the biggest standout.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say about that is I think it was one non-penalty goal or two non-penalty goals after yesterday's match in the last 13 Premier League games. His output slowed down after February. I mean, I wouldn't criticise him for that because he put on the board over 35 goals for club and country over the course of the season. So I don't think I can take anything away from him. And I think that he is the outstanding candidate, was the Football Writers' Player of the Year, is everyone's Player of the Year. But I do think if you're talking about output, towards the end, it certainly did dry up a little bit. And that has to be pointed out. For me, the only other contender was Alexander Isaac. And the reason for that is that he scored an inordinate number of goals, but also scored the goal that won Newcastle a trophy for the first time in 70 years, domestic trophy in 70 years. So I think he deserves consideration. For me, I'd give it to him because I knew that everybody else was going to give it to Mo Salah. But obviously Mo Salah is head and shoulders. I know you've gone for Salah as well, haven't you? So we won't ask you to deliberate too much on that. Who's your Manager of the Year?
Eddie Howe. Won a trophy first time in 70 years, got Newcastle into the Champions League as well. I mean, there's a massive case for Arne Slot, first season in English football, replacing a Liverpool legend in Jurgen Klopp, winning the title. You can't take that away from him, but I think what Eddie Howe achieved at Newcastle is pretty incredible as well.
I've gone Slot. Dean Ashton, who have you gone for?
I've gone for Nuno. I just thought nobody expected them to be anywhere near where they were. He's given them European football in a style that went against, what we've been accustomed to watching a lot of, that bores a lot of people at times, the people that I speak to who watch a lot of football. And, you know, at one point, they had the fewest average possession in the whole of the Premier League, yet they were in the Champions League spots. And I just think he has to take a huge amount of credit for spotting that, to being able to deliver that. And I'm glad that they've got something at the end of what's been a fantastic season.
Yeah, I'm big on Arne Slot, but I understand the Nuno shout. A couple of quick ones for you. Young Player of the Year, just a name?
Dean Howson.
Yeah, he's done very well, £50 million to Real Madrid. What about you, Dean Ashton, Young Player of the Year?
Ethan Nwaneri, I think for me, the age of him is just scary.
It's silly, really, isn't it?
How can you step out of school and do that? I don't really get it.
The only thing, the criteria is obviously different here, but he was nominated for Young Player of the Year for the Premier League, so I've put in Ryan Gravenberch because I think his contribution to that Liverpool team has been absolutely terrific, and the fact they couldn't nail down a position last year, but was the outstanding number 6 this year, I think deserves a mention. Surprise package. Who is your surprise of the season?
Morgan Rogers, and just to give it a little bit of context, Bournemouth had him on loan from Manchester City and didn't see this level of potential that he's managed to fulfill this season. So I think that's why he makes my surprise package. I think he's been a real driving force for Villa.
Dino?
Mine's just Manchester City. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a drop-off of players that good to that poor in such a short space of time. The manager scratching his head visually. I was so shocked by that period that they had. I think it was maybe 15 games where they just looked like they couldn't win and were conceding. And I just couldn't believe the drop-off. To me, that was the biggest surprise of the whole season.
I think the biggest surprise for me over the whole season is Ruben Amorim's failure to have an impact on the results of Manchester United. They have had their worst season in 50 years. It's been absolutely dreadful. It's the worst Old Trafford season since memories began. It's been a terrible campaign. That's the bad surprise. The good surprise, I think, is some of the young recruitment that Spurs have done in Lucas Bergval. To have Archie Gray and Lucas Bergval play as many games as they did, I think deserves a mention. Bergval in particular, he is going to be a top player. Excellent for them. Yes, a little bit of naivety at times. Yes, a few issues here and there. But overall, over the season, I think he's made a contribution to it. Not many teenagers make that level of contribution to a season. He's certainly done that. Thank you very much, Dean Ashton, for your time and energy. We appreciate it over the course of the season. We've still got a lot of podcasts to do. Don't worry about that. We've got the European Championships, the Women's European Championships to come. We've got the England Internationals to come. We've got the Champions League final to look forward to, and the Conference League live on talkSPORT on Wednesday night. And Crookie, don't worry. We'll show you how to win a European trophy.
Come on, Anthony.